joy. It's a joy to have you with us. And thank you, too, for all your careful preparation, which certainly I'm can't tell you how impressed I am. And also thank you for the articles, which I think everybody should read. They're really valuable. And what I'd like to do is to start where you started with your backstory. The list of things you've done. I have to look at the list with my notes because it's so long. You started out, you say here, in electronics.
Oh, yes. By the way, before I begin with some of me, I should also mention that this presentation is in many ways a joint effort with my wife, Renee.
I know it is. And what I just want to put in, I was going to put it at the end, but I'll put it in right now. We wanted Renee to have her own hour because Renee is a lawyer, an attorney, and she is dealing with the law and autism. And we thought that should go on a separate hour. So I don't know if she's watching right now, but if she is, just tell her we're getting to her, and we're going to put her on with the judge.
Oh, excellent. The judge. Oh,
yes, the judge also has a child on the spectrum.
Right. Well, now let me return then, but I wanted to thank Renee. Both, we've raised Alex together and have been through this experience together for 22 years, not approaching your experience and that of many others, but we're getting there. And it's her insights, our give and take that have helped develop what I'll be telling you about. So my background, one reason I wanted to tell people about my background is so they can weigh or decide when I make comments where they're coming from. They can know the context. And one of the pieces of context is I used to, and still do, build electronic things. And the reason I bring that up is because building a piece of electronics, in my mind, is a little bit akin to building a brain. And that's what I'm trying to do now, professionally and personally. But what I did years ago was maybe the Sandlot version of trying to build a brain. What I then did is I went to med school and became a neurologist. And that is, of course, the medical science of the brain. But then I also then went to graduate school and did a PhD in experimental psychology, which is the software, if you like, engineering of the mind. And it's melding those two together, along with the electronics background, I think gives me the perspective that I'll be talking about. But
you're also a physician.
Yes, so the med school and neurologist is the physician part.
I see.
I jumped over that. But the physician part has changed over the years. I'll tell you how it's changed. Had our Alex 22 years ago. Before that time, I had been perhaps more reluctant to tell people, call it the facts, or what I guesstimated to be the facts were, than I am now, because I realized that people need as much information as possible, even if that information is not completely known. They need to know what the boundaries of known and not known are. So having Alex has changed me as a physician, because I now give people vastly more information. I used to think I did a good job, but I think I do a better job now of telling people what's known, what's not known, and where we need to find things out. The other thing I should tell you, Eustacia, that being a physician did, coupled with the science background, scientists traditionally study and learn, but aren't necessarily the doers. One of the interesting problems with being a physician, as you're aware from being a mother yourself, is no matter how much you know, at that moment you've got to act. You've got to do something. You've got to do it on the best available knowledge. You know that it's not perfect. You know that 10, 20 years from now things will be different, but this is what you have to do now. And I think the combination, and you'll hear it in the programs I've been developing, are a constant tension between getting it done now and can we wait a little longer, can we think about it more, or what's going to happen that's going to change our minds in the future.
That's a wonderful combination. The story I've always given to people was when I used to study all through the night and we lived across the street from a farm, and that's when I learned that roosters crow at 3 a.m. They don't crow when the sun comes up. They crow in the dark.
The reality.
That's when they start the new day, and I thought, that's what we do. We're roosters. We crow in the dark, and we don't know what that day will bring to us.
I think your analogy is especially apt because the public image of autism is like the rooster crowing at dawn, but it ain't really that. You have to go to a farmer, somebody who actually keeps chickens and roosters, to know what's going on.
That's right. That's right. Well, there was another one here that I wanted to speak of, and that was your combination, the link between education and research, because you have also directed an educational program. Is this aimed at educating neurobiologists, at educating parents?
The educational program I'm referring to is actually one for several individuals, but one at a time. One of them is my son, done privately, personally. The other is for a young man with autism, somewhat like my son. You can read about him in part if you go to my Hopkins website. We have an NPR piece that describes some of the work we've been doing with him. And both of them basically represent an attempt to say, given what we know now and what we might learn in the foreseeable near future, 5 or 10 years, what can we do to improve the status of these individuals? And I call that education because most of it is really education. It's not drugs. It's not gene therapy. It's not even electrical stimulation of the brain. Those are not yet ready for rollout to people individually, at least not on a non-research basis. So that program, it began with my attempt to work with Renee and work with Alex's teachers and speech therapists and everybody else to train him better. My background, by the way, in neurology was specifically in 2 areas, among other things: memory, which is learning, and speech and language. So in autism, and especially in the low-functioning individuals with autism, where they can't learn and they don't speak, it unfortunately seemed tailor-made for someone like me. And what I've tried to do is meld that with the science in a 2-way street. So in one way, the science gets informed by what are the educational challenges? What are the questions that a teacher or a parent would ask every day that need to be answered and that, in fact, no one has answered? So that, for example, a typical question that comes up with lower functioning individuals is, should I use ABA? Should I use applied behavioral analysis? Should I use errorless learning? How does that compare to errorful learning? And it turns out the answer is not so simple and not completely known, but you do the best you can. So that's how the education kind of informs the science. Conversely, the science attempts to inform the education by doing the following. First of all, can you make your teaching more rigorous? Can you get a better handle on whether what you're doing is successful or not, rather than just kind of throwing it out to the wind and hoping to see what happens? Also, is there a broader perspective you can bring? Namely, people have been researching these problems for many decades. Has anybody seen any problem comparable to yours? Have people thought about it? Have they tried to do it? And if they tried to do it, what worked and what didn't? You know, it's a little bit like Edison. I'll bring him up. You know, when he mentioned in developing the light bulb, it's classic that he had 10,000 failures. And when someone asked him, well, you had 10,000 failures, he said, no, I now know 10,000 ways that I'm not going to do it again, or words to that effect.
Yes.
And I would not like to have every parent and every teacher have to do the 10,000 ways on their own. I'd like to benefit from the world knowledge and prior knowledge as we move forwards.
I couldn't agree more. The other thing when you speak of teaching is each teacher who helped Temple, and Temple, the Children's Hospital in Boston, recommended speech lessons for Temple and told me who to go to. Now, Mrs. Reynolds, who had the school, she also taught me at the same time. I didn't know. I was very young and even younger emotionally, socially. So what she taught me also serviced both of us. And now what do I meet at different conferences? And it's always the question of autism is a 2-way street. We're social creatures. We're incomplete without each other. So when you have a child who does not know who you are, if my child doesn't know who I am, who am I? I run into that problem all the time of identity being a combination of individual and social. And what it led me to pursuing and what helped with Temple was to understand, first of all, until she could talk, she couldn't really join us That when she learned to talk, she learned to join us.
Yes. And, well, as you know, I've been very interested because my son, Alex, was nonverbal and is basically nonverbal orally, but he now, like some of these children, has learned to read and to type to some extent. So we communicate with him both by looking at his expressions and his gestures, like pulling us out of the room or going to the front door and gesturing, or he'll type it for us, and we'll type to him in return. And I agree with you. We know as human beings that language is probably our major distinguishing feature from every other animal on the planet. And once you have language, you can do so much more. Education, socially, everything. So a lot of my efforts have been devoted to trying to understand the roots of language and what is missing in many of these individuals who don't have language or who don't have adequate communication. By the way, I should preface this by telling you, this is a big, big job. And so I'm not going to, first of all, claim that I've been able to do it, or second of all, that we've been doing it alone. We've been resting, as Newton once said, on the shoulders of many giants, standing on the shoulders of many giants, not resting there, in trying to understand what are the precursors for language in each individual. And also, by the way, taking my insights, if you like, or the insights of medicine and psychology to look at an individual approach. So while there are things that maybe individuals with autism will have in common with each other, there are many things that they have different from each other too, and those are important.
Yeah, but it is there are enough tendencies, traits that they share that gives them a similarity. The other thing that's amazed me as I travel around the world is I can go to Hong Kong and be translated into Mandarin. I can go to Budapest and be translated into Hungarian. But when I talk about certain things about autism, they all nod their heads.
Yes.
Now, so they all know each other's children. In other words, there's enough similarity between all the children that transcends individual nations.
Well, yes, and in fact, that's one reason we can give it a term, a diagnosis of autism, and why it looks like something that's independent of culture. It looks like something that's biologic. Well, and independent of culture. Well, wait. Okay. Well, here we may have our first public disagreement. We'll see.
Good for it. Go for it.
Well, let me tell you my position, because I usually tell. By the way, I tell patients and their families that in general, if they hear doctors disagreeing, in general, the doctors are either disagreeing about the facts or the logic and how they weight the logic. But fundamentally, often, good doctors are not disagreeing with each other. They're just dealing with different facts or different inferences. So here's my basis for my statement. There are commonalities across individuals we call autism or having autism, apparently across cultures. And by the way, I haven't done it across enough cultures to comment on that professionally. But I'll also comment that there are important individual differences, just as there are individual differences in the people we call human beings. So just as a normal human being can vary in size by a factor of 2, namely you can have somebody who's 4 feet tall and somebody who's 8 feet tall, and they're all almost within the range of normal.
Yes.
So you can have enormous differences, probably even much greater differences among individuals with autism. And one reason I bring that up is because when we've been trying to design treatment strategies, we've often had to ignore the common features of autism, if you like, and focus on the particular individual instantiation of that particular individual. For example, I'll just go back to my Alex again. While he cannot speak and clearly has a problem with forming words, but actually forming any sounds at all, he was able to develop the reading and writing, had an interest in it from an early age. Yet in contrast, I've seen other individuals who can be taught to speak, right, and who can't seem to get the reading or writing that easily. And I don't know all the reasons for that. That's one of the reasons I have a research effort going on, but it's there, and it's something we have to confront.
Yeah.
So that one of the other things is that we've tried to take advantage of I'll call it teachable moments, which are individual. Like one person may be fascinated by whales, and another individual may be fascinated by dogs, and you don't know why whales have a special attraction or dogs have a special attraction. Or let me take the prototypical one, Barney the dinosaur.
Yes.
Okay? And whatever the reason why they latch on to that particular one, is what we might try to use as a wedge to get into their minds and into their preferences and into their motivation to open up a channel of communication or open up their thinking. So I'll stop there and turn it over to the...
Well, there was another question that leapt into my mind. Wait a minute, it'll come back in a minute, of what I wanted to go for. In the meantime, let me just look down your list here of what... I know what it was I wanted to say to you. People keep talking about autism as a disorder, and I see it much more as something incomplete. It's as though the brain didn't finish its job before this child arrived.
Well,
and that's one of the reasons education works.
Well,
I think we quicken something.
Okay, I've come to, again, we'll have our second perhaps public debate.
Disagreement,
yes, or whatever.
Or exploration.
Well, I'm concerned. Let's put it this way. I don't care what anybody calls it, if you want to call it incomplete or what have you, so long as we can agree on what's going on or what we think is going on. So that, for example, in many ways, the brains of individuals with autism are probably very complete. For example, their visual abilities seem to be extraordinary often.
Yes, it's extraordinary.
Right? And one of the concerns I have with labeling too quickly is I don't want the label to cut off thinking about what you're dealing with. So that it's entirely possible that, for instance, the brain of an individual with autism is incomplete and not yet fully developed. But it's also possible it's more than fully developed in some areas and underdeveloped in others, or it's possible that the wiring is wrong, even though the pieces are in place, or a whole host of things. And one of the important things I'd like to try to keep in mind, or I try to force myself to keep in mind, is to keep an open mind. In debate, classically, you're supposed to be able to debate both sides of the question. You endorse one position, and then you're supposed to be able to debate the other side. In science and theory, we should have the same approach. Namely, you should respect people who think you're totally wrong. Well, let's put it this way. You may not respect the people, but you can respect at least the arguments. You should allow for the possibility that you are completely wrong, because only in that way can you get the strongest possible conclusion of what you're doing. So we don't actually know what's wrong in the brain of autistic individuals in the sense of know with 100% certainty. There is, of course, some evidence now that the genetic defects that have given rise to the known genetic causes of autism, for the most part, and I may say all, but I'm not an expert in that, seem to involve the way the brain gets wired, namely the way nerve cells find each other. And that seems to be that's probably a very important clue. The problem is that it doesn't right now help you solve the problem of how to deal with the individual who has a miswired brain. In other words, knowing that the brain is miswired still means you have to look in other areas to try to take care of their problem, other domains to take care of their problem, because that doesn't give you the answer. But probably a future science will find it useful. The analogy, by the way, I sometimes bring up is the condition called cystic fibrosis, which, as everyone is aware, is a genetic defect where something is wrong with one of the kind of proteins, one of the chemicals that the body uses to coat the lining of the lungs and throat and everywhere else. The genes responsible for cystic fibrosis, or the errors in the genes, have been known now for some time. I think there's over 50 of them known. And in that sense, by the way, it's analogous to autism. Yet no one's yet been able to come up with a genetic therapy for cystic fibrosis, to my knowledge. And the genes have been known, I think, for 15, maybe even 20 years. And the protein disorder has been known for a while. So it's entirely possible that we will come to know why autism is, but still have to look at other ways of treating those individuals who currently have it.
Well, I agree, absolutely. Here's another thought to throw out. Animals have their anomalies. We have sport ducks, we have lone wolves, we have rogue elephants, the duck that won't fly in the social formation that ducks fly in, the V. And animals seem to be able to accept it, just move away from it. I think we're more complicated in that autism is also throwing us off. We don't know how to be ourselves with this person.
Well, it's certainly discomforting to people. We know that every parent, I'm sure, has had the experience of somebody else saying, "Why can't you control your child?"
Oh,
Or
that's always part of the picture. But it's more something closer, something that, why are you and I able to reach each other electronically in a way that you can't always reach somebody on the spectrum?
Well, by the way, I asked once, I went to a well-known animal husbandry university and asked them, did they ever see any analogs of intellectual deficiency, autism, or anything like that? He says, well, yes and no. The problem is that in the wild, even in a controlled environment, those animals are shunned or die. They just don't survive because they just don't, living in the wild is very hard. I have a high respect for the deer that managed to get through a winter, because we barely got through this winter.
And it's not over.
I know, and it's not over yet. And I have a healthy respect for these animals and their intelligence and their bonding. But the fact of the matter is that animals that are born with problems suffer even greater problems. I think one of the things I'm thankful for is that we as human beings, for the most part, manage to help or try to help individuals with disabilities such as autism and keep them as one of our own, recognize that they're part of us.
Yes.
And everybody. By the way, another position I should emphasize before it's not too much, one of the points I make is that every human being has some kind of disability. That as a physician, as an experimental psychologist, you realize that there's virtually nobody perfect, not even models. They just hide their flaws.
Their bodies may be perfect. There may be other lives.
Or at least the parts you don't see may not be that perfect. Because
they won't show you what doesn't work.
That's right. So photographers do a pretty good job of covering up things. I mentioned this only for the following. Remember I mentioned earlier the enormous variation between people? It's part and parcel that we don't really know what works in human beings. We know what works for human beings in general, but people vary greatly. Somebody has straight hair, somebody has wavy hair, somebody has thin hair, somebody has thinning hair, and it's all part of the variety of people. And at different times and different conditions, it could be good, it could be bad. And I mention this because in some ways, some of the traits that are present in autism, as we know, are actually beneficial to people. The obsessiveness, attention to detail, the visual ability, the ability to concentrate.
I agree with you. Every time I fly, which is more often than I want the air controller to be obsessive.
Exactly. You want the air controller.
It is in his hands.
That's right. You want the air controller to be focused on you, just like my Alex would focus on Barney, the dinosaur, for hours on end. And so one of the suspicions, as you know, floating around with conditions like autism, is that maybe whatever the genes are, they convey some advantage to the people that have some of them, even though if you have too great a dose, you have problems. So somewhat akin to sickle cell disease or thalassemia, where people that have a partial form of the condition actually are resistant to malaria, while people who have the full form of the condition have problems or can have problems. There's been suspicion that diseases or conditions, whatever you want to call them, like autism, represent a larger experimentation, if you like, that Mother Nature is experimenting with humans to see, in a sense, what works and what doesn't. And a little bit of obsessiveness, a little bit of focus, a little bit of great visual abilities can go a long way. I'd throw that out as a speculation, but I'm aware people have been talking about that with autism, with other diseases, other conditions.
Well, I agree. I think of bipolar, and most comedians are bipolar. They're not going to show you their downside.
Yes.
But we love them. They make us laugh, and we need that laughter.
And
to it.
So we had a question, if I can interrupt, can you hear me?
Sure.
From Annette Hunt, wanted to know, is there a genetic identifier for autism, when you were discussing that before? So she just wanted to know if there was a genetic identifier for autism. As you mentioned with cystic fibrosis, there were 50 of them. So I don't know if you can expand on that a little bit before the question gets too far away from the discussion.
Sure. I'll expand. I assume people have heard the question. that correct?
Yes, yes, everyone should first
So,
name.
first of all, I'm not a geneticist, but my knowledge is that, to my understanding, about 15% of cases of autism perhaps now might have a genetic or discoverable genetic component, especially when one uses research methods. I don't know how validated those research methods are. I don't know how ready for prime time they are. But most cases of autism, while suspected as being genetic, in many respects, the genes involved, the proteins or whatever it is involved, have not yet been proven, have not yet been shown. So the answer to your question, Annette, is kind of twofold, or two different directions. We look, clinically, people look for what they can look for, and most cases of autism will not have anything discoverable. But on the near horizon, thanks to work such as that recently published from a set that Autism Speaks helped sponsor, there's increasing evidence that they can find genes that will be responsible. What to do with them is another story, but evidence that we can find them.
Well, also, how do you know whether the gene is going to turn on? In other words, you and I might carry the gene too.
Yes, and by the way, this is to my knowledge, this is an extremely complicated area. And Eustacia, you've raised a very good point. Namely, you can have a bad gene, but it may not be turned on in you, or it may be buffered by genes in other cells. So that, for example, it's well known that, for example, women have 2 X chromosomes, and in general, one of those X chromosomes is deactivated in cells in the body, so the other one can work unimpeded. And the mechanism that does that, to my knowledge, is not completely known, but yes, something like that may be occurring in autism. In fact, one of the hypotheses about autism, I think, out there is that perhaps it represents the unimpeded action of some genes. Namely, it's not something's missing, maybe there's too much of something. But again, I leave that to the geneticists, the neurochemists, and others. That's not really my area, and I've learned you can make many big errors if you go outside your area.
Well, I can't resist bringing up the question of mirror neurons.
Okay.
The work of Ramachandran, where he feels that the mirror neuron system is much bigger than we've given it credit for being.
And I'll bring up the work of Greg Hickok, who has argued, if I understand him correctly, that mirror neurons are overrated. So you see, therefore, we don't even have to have this debate between ourselves. We can have other people make the debate. So let's put it this way. The discovery of mirror neurons was a tremendous advance. And what they represent isn't still clear. But they may not be the answer, because before the mirror neuron, there has to be something else feeding information to it. And right now, I know that there's a debate going on as to exactly the status of mirror neurons. Again, it's not my fight, and so I've just watched it from afar. But I'll put it a little differently. It's not clear that mirror neurons are what is responsible for autism. Let's just put it that way. It's not even clear, by the way, Eustacia. In fact, I think there's fairly good evidence that there's not one autism, but many autisms. Not just the low, medium, and high functioning, but maybe even other autisms in the middle, or different than that. And one point I and others have made is the notion of autism as a spectrum is a useful first approximation, but probably it's more useful, at least for research and maybe even educational purposes, to think of autism as a multidimensional thing. Not one line, but many different dimensions, some of which can be larger or smaller than the others. So you can have the social dimension, you can have the intellectual dimension, you can have a visual dimension, you can have a language dimension, and they all may vary across from each other or differently than each other.
So we had another question, Barry, and it's just going to be another debate, but I'll bring it up anyway.
What is the debate?
Yeah. So it was somebody just saying, how do you avoid the pitfalls of genetic identification, including selective reproduction? Where do you fall on that? Having this, so go for it, because that's people with autism are very concerned about that. I mean, they're quite pleased with who they are as people, and then someone starting, "Oh, we need to cure you," is always, it's an odd conversation to have with somebody who's very capable of understanding what their disability is and what it does to them as a person. They're the pitfalls and also the good parts about who they are. So, so where do you fall on that?
Well, this is the one where you really have to have my wife, because when it comes to genetic selection, I think two people are still usually involved in human reproduction. You know, again, I'm willing to be corrected, but two are somehow involved. The only other, I have to sidestep that.
I do believe they are working on 3, though, Barry. If
I know England has approved 3, but they're always in the forefront there. And you know, I've read a science fiction novel where there were 12 different genders involved in reproduction, and you may remember the classic Woody Allen comment when he, in Sleeper, I think, where he says, "Oh, there's just 2 of us. There's not enough for sex." So, but in all seriousness, as I mentioned, it's probably a mixed bag. In other words, there's no single good or bad thing. It's probable that the traits that draw one person to another may in fact be good ones, and if sometimes the outcome is an autistic child, and sometimes it may be an Einstein, or a dancer, or an artist, a Picasso, you know, a Martha, a Martha, the dancer Martha, not the one that immediately comes to mind, the dancer Martha.
Martha Graham.
Martha Graham, thank you. Okay. Martha Stewart has her own qualities, but you know. And,
well, what I can't resist throwing in was Jerry Newport's story. This was at a gathering, a conference of doctors exchanging material, researchers. And this woman stood up and she talked about the research they were doing to locate the genetic causes of autism. And Jerry Newport stood up in the Q&A and he said, "I'm Asperger. Is the point of your research to do away with me?" Mm-hmm. Well, she was shocked silent. The next day she caught me at breakfast and she said, "How could he think that?" She said, "All we're trying to do is help."
Well, the people being helped may not think of it that way, or that you think you're helping may not think of it that way. So let's put it this way. I see 2 sides or 3 sides or 4 sides or maybe 12 sides to this question. But right now, I also think that what we know of the genetics is not so secure, not so clear, that we should probably be making mating choices based on it alone. I know Simon Baron-Cohen has had the hypothesis of what's called assortative mating, namely that individuals with autistic traits are now finding each other, whereas they couldn't find each other before. Maybe because they're watching they're watching, what's that again? Here I'm blocking again, that TV show that the multi-body problem, the many-body problem, which I've never seen.
I don't know the show.
Okay. There's a show that apparently involves, that includes physicists. I think it's called the many-body problem. And, remember, 30 years ago, it was not fashionable to be a geek. And now, or nerd. And now it's
good marriage partners. They make a lot of money.
That's right. And, of course, are very interesting people besides, because money isn't everything, right? Eustacia?
Absolutely.
So I better step away from that question now.
Can we move to some of the things you, now as a child of an adult with autism, it's kind of changed your focus? I mean, I'm sure that you were totally immersed in getting Alex to talk, and now it's what's Alex going to do, and not for the rest of his life, but just for even, in the next 5 years, a 5-year plan for him. So you want to talk about some of the things that you have done as you've grown with Alex?
Well, again, this has been a joint effort, and much more joint towards Renee than me. But what's been done with Alex basically has been, together with his teachers, therapists, and everybody, has been preparing him for a life outside of school. And now he's in a group home, plus he goes to a day habilitation program. We ideally try to have a visit perhaps once a weekend or so. What we've been most proud of is that he made the transition, that he, whatever we did, whatever everybody else did, and what he did for himself, he became a quasi-independent individual, able to function in a group home, not have any particular problems with his roommates, his housemates, and tolerate things like the bus breaking down or the bus stopping, which, as all of us who've dealt with autistic individuals know, can be a big problem. What we are looking forward to in the next 5 years involves not just Alex, but potentially more. one of my goals, and Renee's goals as well, is we know that, first of all, these individuals don't stop learning. The notion that you leave school at 18 and because you've stopped learning is just ridiculous. I mean, you leave school at 18 for other reasons, but people learn throughout their lives. And so whether we're hoping both through educational efforts and through training, through research, that we can discover other ways. Sorry. We'll have to let that go. Okay? Well, what we want to do, personally and professionally, is try to figure out what individuals like this need in the next 5 or 10 years. What will make them even better? And, for example, are there better ways of teaching? Are there better ways of finding out what their hidden skills are? Because I know many parents of individuals with autism think and believe and know that their children have skills that just aren't well shown because of their behavioral problems, because of their speech problems, because of whatever else it is, but that they have talents that might be uncovered. And one of the things we're hopeful is that we may be able to help uncover them. We may be able to find avenues to uncover them. I also think that perhaps we can find better ways for these individuals to spend their time. That the old vocational models, which are probably having their problems anyway, of a lot of rote work, have been disappearing for a long time. And we need to think of new ways that individuals with autism can be occupied, and occupied productively for themselves and for society. So I touch on a few of them. Renee and I touch on a few of them in the article we did for PBS NewsHour that's accessible now. So I won't elaborate on them more here, but that's what we kind of have our goals set on for the next 5 or 10 years.
Well, I'd like to just throw in some thought about Temple, who was mainstreamed at 5 years old. How much mainstream mattered to her? We're not looking at children, other children. They're much more aware than we give them credit for being, and they're able to adjust. They haven't made up their mind about each other yet. And the first thing Temple learned was, well, if I wanted to play with them, I had to follow the rules of the game. Otherwise, they wouldn't let me play. So she played the games by their rules. Then they began to discover that she was fun to be with. She made up things that they hadn't thought of. She had a kite she used to make that if you tied it onto the back of your bike and rode very fast, the kite would go up in the air. Well, they all wanted a bicycle kite.
Sure.
And so she was able to bring to the group her talents. But she did have to play the game by their rules, and wanted to. So, because she wanted to be part of the group.
One of the points. Oh, sorry.
I was just going to say, to finish it, that what also she loved in the school was they had workshops. They had both sewing and carpentry. Now, Temple embroiders beautifully and loves to make things. In fact, all of my children loved making things. I've got a footstool right here below me that one of them made, 50 years ago? It's still a dandy little footstool. I think, why have we dropped out of ordinary school carpentry and sewing?
Sure. By the way, if I can take that opportunity, you just brought up the reason why I think that there are commonalities in individuals with autism, but also important differences we should be aware of. As Renee had suggested, I included as one of the questions or points is, when parents ask, how can I make my child into a Temple Grandin, the answer should be, you can't.
You can't.
You can't. But also, she's unique. But I'll also add, Eustacia, although I might call you a mother in a general sense, you're a mother of Temple, but you're also a unique mother. Your interaction with what you did and what you and Temple did together was also unique. And what I would argue is that every parent, every set of teachers of individuals with autism have to think about their unique strengths and weaknesses, their semi-unique strengths and weaknesses.
Well, I think what that is not to be like everybody else, but to be fulfilled as they would like to be fulfilled. Mm-hmm. Temple ideally, but I think Temple is fulfilled as she would like to be fulfilled. It's her idea of how she wants to live her life. And sometimes we keep pushing for what our idea of what normal is. Well, what is normal, and normal for what?
A very good point. For example, Renee and I have had to come to grips for years with the fact that what Alex enjoys is not necessarily what we'd enjoy, but he's happier than we are.
That's right.
If happiness is the goal, he loves it. And if happiness is the goal, he's way up there. He's in the top 99th percentile of humanity, from what I can tell. And by the way, one of the things that combination of education and science I brought up earlier is trying to figure out is, what skills does an individual need to acquire so they can be fulfilled as much as possible? We all know that school involves delayed gratification. You could, right? And we also know, so we as parents, we as teachers have to think, what am I going to do for this child, this individual with autism, that although they may not like it that much now, will be better for them in the long run than letting them sit and watch Barney, say, or whatever the equivalent is. And that's one of the ongoing processes, I think, that every set of parents, every teacher and therapist has to think about with each individual with autism. So we can have a goal of making them fulfilled. And by the way, I think those are very important questions to be asking. What is fulfilling? What is the good life we want these individuals to have?
Well, some of it, here's where curiosity comes in. I think of the fact that Temple in third grade couldn't read, and the teacher, she and I used to keep in close touch with each other. And she said, can you help? Well, I like to read. So I picked out The Wizard of Oz, actually, which she'd never read. I said, okay, I'm going to read a chapter, then you can read a chapter or a page. Well, I cheated a bit in the beginning and read a little longer and gave her a little less to read. Do you know what worked? Curiosity. She wanted to know how the story went. She didn't want the See, Dick, Run books. They bored her. And we have to remember, our kids get bored. All kids get bored.
Yes. One of the important things we've tried to do in the educational programs is keep the kids at the border zone between boredom and frustration, because it's a very, and by the way, teachers have known this for a long, long time, and neuroscience is now catching up perhaps to what teachers have known, that you learn maximally when you're not overly frustrated, when you're not bored to tears with the repetition, but when you're just on the cusp of grasping something, and it's also interesting to you as well. So the modern day equivalent of The Wizard of Oz is probably the Harry Potter series, which I understand has taught more kids to read than any teacher.
I believe that. But what struck me as I read The Wizard of Oz was there were a lot of much tougher words than you'd give a third grader. And by sounding them out, we'd break the syllables down. Temple liked that. Oh, I see how that goes. And she could break them pretty soon. She could break the syllables down herself. And there was the word.
Well, there was a time, and when Baum wrote, I think it was Baum, wrote
it was.
The book.
L. Frank Baum.
In 1900, if I recall.
Yeah, that's
right. By the way, I don't have a direct memory of that myself, but 1900. But there was an era when people actually did not teach down the children. So the McGruffy's readers contained a number of difficult words that that children had to learn. And many of us begrudge the fact that things have become too digested now, that you need to stretch a little bit as you read. As you need to stretch a little bit as you do anything to learn maximally. But
yes, even for me to learn how to get to you on the Internet. I think, I don't want to learn this. Yes, I do, because I want to talk to you.
So, Barry, could you just go over a little, kind of sum it up here with some of your current major research directions that I pulled up there? And I think you hit on them a little bit before, but I think it'd be a nice way to let people know what you're doing, and maybe they can email us and tell you what they think you should be doing.
Sure, and actually, I'm sure they'll tell me what they think I should be doing. The written description does better than I probably can do right now, but in a nutshell, we're trying to think of themes that are both, call it educational, but also can be accomplished in theory over the next 5 or 10 years. Namely, not something that might benefit people 100 years from now, but something that might actually be translatable into actual kind of practice, even if it's only a research practice, in 5 or 10 years. So, for example, we've still been concerned with we have one of our research projects is trying to understand what individuals know even if they can't say it. So there's an evoked potential study being done by Drs. Kerry Ledoux and Emily Coderre and others, which are using brainwaves to try to detect when people know something even if they can't speak what they know. And we're trying to use that as a way of making, among other things, the training more efficient, because that way you don't have to duplicate what somebody already knows. You can move on to something new. Another project we're trying is using a method called transcranial direct current stimulation. That involves passing a weak electric current through the intact head. It's purely a research technique right now. People such as Jason von Steenberg and others have been trying this with individuals with autism. And our hope is that we might be able to improve or give an extra boost to some mental functions that are important in everyday life and thinking. Some preliminary data along those lines, not yet ready for complete prime time, but some preliminary data along those lines. Kyung-Ji Sung has been looking at vision in individuals with autism, and he's also been looking at aspects of this electrical stimulation and seeing whether he can boost aspects of vision, not yet in individuals with autism, but in other individuals using this technique. And we're also beginning to explore, in a very preliminary work that Dr. Joseph Dean is starting, along with others, the role of anxiety. Because although I'm a cognitive scientist, everybody knows that being anxious kind of wipes you out and can block you. And it's also in general appreciated, or I think generally accepted, that individuals with autism are more anxious than other individuals, or get more anxious than other individuals do. So we're starting a pilot project to try to measure that anxiety and to determine whether naturalistic interventions, namely those that are already happening, might help such individuals more than anybody thought they would. And if that's the case, then we might actually move to a more direct intervention model. Those are just, in the interest of time, those are just the very top, and not even maybe the right tops. My research description describes more what our philosophy is and where we're going with it. And there's a large number of people involved who are also listed, hopefully, on the website that I can barely do justice to right here.
I would just throw in this, because I think all young children have trouble talking. This came out about siblings who are having trouble living their life with a sibling who is on the spectrum. And this counselor had a great big dollhouse with every kind of doll and furniture you can imagine. And she would say to these very little children, maybe 4 years old, "You can decorate the dollhouse any way you want to." She said the scenes they made told her what the problem was.
What was that? Oh, the scenes, the way the scenes that they said.
The way they built the dollhouse.
Oh, I see.
Put the scene in the dollhouse together.
Yes.
Told her what the child could not tell her in words.
See. She observed that. And good therapists do that, yes.
Yeah.
Yes. You know, part of the problem, of course, is you're dealing with individuals on, I'll use that term spectrum right now, who vary greatly in their abilities. So some will not even begin to approach trying to put dolls in a dollhouse.
Dolls into a dollhouse. Yes, I use the word only because I've been instructed to.
There you go.
I don't know that I would use it ordinarily.
Good.
Well, this has been really amazing and informative. Any last words from either one of you as we kind of wrap this up? Because I think that there's an awful lot of information that came out of this. If you want to hit on anything you didn't, take this time. And if anybody has any questions, send them to us.
Most of all, Barry, I want to thank you for doing this and to say that, yes, we do want Renee. We just thought it would be a good idea for you to have your own space.
Thank you.
And I hope very much to be continued.
Thank you. And Eustacia, I want to thank you and Temple for basically the pioneering work you've been doing and the leading light you both have been for autism efforts, for autism research, because it's only by seeing real-life examples of what can be accomplished that we know it's possible and can aim for that. So thank you, and thanks to Temple.